I'm sure you've heard of the Houthis, also known as the Houthi rebels. You've probably also heard the very catchy Houthi slogan, God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, the victory to Islam. Now, I prefer women life freedom. But hey, I even prefer alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But that's just me. Nevertheless, I've become curious about the Houthis, who they are, what they believe, and what they want. I thought you might be too. So I've asked Edmund Fitton-Brown to join us. Edmund is a former British ambassador to Yemen, and he's now a senior fellow here at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focused on Arabian Peninsula issues, as well as terrorism and terrorism's enablers. Edmund attended Cambridge, and he speaks Arabic, Finnish, French, and Italian. I'm Cliff May, and it's jolly good you're joining us too, here on Foreign Policy. Ambassador Edmund, welcome, and good to see you.
Thank you. Great to be back with you, Cliff.
Yes. Look, let's get personal to start. Tell us how you became ambassador to Yemen. I mean, were you offered like Finland, France, and Italy, but you figured, that's boring. I'll take Yemen, a country, by the way, that's been in active warfare 4 out of every 10 years over the past half century, with the current civil war, we'll talk more about it, that began in 2014 being the longest continuous conflict in this period.
Well, first of all, I've always found conflict diplomacy more interesting than the kind of things that you would end up discussing in Paris or Berlin. So there's that. Secondly, there's the issue of competition. It's amazing how many people want to go to Paris or Berlin, and it's amazing how few people, or not so amazing, how few people want the job of ambassador to Yemen. So there was an element of it being available, but also I was pre-positioned for it. It was a slightly unusual sequence of events, but basically I took a regional role in Dubai from 2011 to 2014, where I was responsible for a number of security issues in the Arabian Peninsula, the whole peninsula. And that included counterterrorism. And in those days, it was sort of the heyday of AQAP. You remember the famous bomb technician, Ibrahim al-Asiri. Everyone was worried that the next plane that fell out of the sky would be blown up by one of his explosive innovations. And so the fact that I was helping to run our counter-terrorist interests in Yemen put me in the frame potentially to go there and become ambassador. And when that was discussed with me, I said, well, that sounds really interesting because I'm enjoying the work I'm doing on Yemen, but I would also enjoy the sort of very different set of challenges that you would face as the head of mission. So I took it.
And as I recall, because I've talked to you a little bit about this before, you weren't based in Yemen, you were still based in Dubai. But I also know, because you discussed this with Bill Roggio on another FDD podcast, Generation Jihad, that you actually did sit down and you have actually interacted with the Houthi rebels. And I'm curious to know a little more. You've talked a little bit about with Bill, about how that went. You don't invite them to the embassy and serve cocktails, I imagine. It doesn't quite go like that.
Yeah. So the sequence of events was this. When I accepted the appointment to go to Yemen, I left Dubai and I went through a long training period in London that took me over from late 2014 to early 2015. And you'll remember that this is when the civil war in Yemen was going worse and worse for poor old President Hadi. And he was arrested. And he managed to escape dressed as a woman, and he fled south and set up his capital in Aden in the south. And all this time, I was taking part in Whitehall meetings and video calls with the mission in Sana'a with my predecessor, Jane Marriott. And it was all about, could we stay in Sana'a or would we have to evacuate? And I was hoping that they would stay because what I said to Jane at one point was, if you can swing it at all for me to be the one who evacuates, if I can even have a week in Sana'a, that would be really helpful to me. Now, I'd been to Sana'a multiple times on visits from Dubai, but unfortunately, you and we, the Americans and the Brits, evacuated just a couple of weeks before I was due to deploy to Sana'a. And I was then presented with the problem of, well, where am I going to be ambassador? And what we decided to do, in fact, was to open the embassy to Yemen in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And the reason for that is that, as you know, Jeddah used to be the capital of Saudi Arabia. So we and the Americans have both got huge consulate general premises there, which were very much underused. So we had all this office space and residential space that we were able to simply walk into with the agreement of my colleague, then the British ambassador to Riyadh, Simon Collis. So that was how I came to be in Jeddah. But Jeddah was only a base. It was a useful base, but a lot of the job was about traveling. And one of the first things that I did was travel to meet the Houthis. Now, the Houthis were not in Saudi Arabia. They were, and of course still are, in Oman, in Muscat. And the Omanis, who like to market themselves as great conflict resolvers, you know, they were the midwives of the JCPOA, infamously. They arranged for me to meet with the Houthis in Muscat, and I had one core task, and that was to persuade the Houthis to meet with the United States, because for curious reasons, they were talking to us, but not to you at that time. And so if we were going to get anywhere in terms of discussing possible peace, it was going to be necessary for the US to have a relationship with the Houthis. And so I went to Muscat to negotiate that. And it was successful, in fact. But it was picturesque as well. I had 2 meetings with them, which were hosted in these perfumed palaces, or I should say a perfumed palace stroke guest house, by the Omanis, who were immaculate hosts, incredibly gracious, supplied amazing food and refreshments, wonderful aromatic coffee and all the rest of it. You can see how people get seduced by this stuff. But, I was not seduced by the Houthis because they were pretty much the roughest bunch of roughnecks that I had ever dealt with. I had 2 meetings with them, one, I think 6 hours, one 5 hours, all completely in Arabic. So it was probably the best Arabic practice I've ever had as well. And they said a few things that were really interesting. I mean, okay, mission accomplished. About a week later, they met with the Americans, so we were fine. And of course, I saw a lot of them after that during the various rounds of peace talks that took place in Switzerland and in Kuwait. But during those first meetings, they said a couple of things that have always stayed with me. One was, I said, why are you guys allied with Ali Abdullah Saleh, the deposed former president of Yemen, when he has more Houthi blood on his hands than anyone else in Yemen? And, I thought that was a pretty good sort of, slam dunk sort of success. But they one thing I will give the Houthis is that they're very direct in the way that they answer you. They said, don't lecture us about Ali Abdullah Saleh. Anyone who wants something from him will deal with him. We want something from him, so we're dealing with him. When we cease to want something from him, we will kill him. And they did. They did exactly that. And the other thing that they said that was really striking...
Ain't beanbag, their version of politics. Ain't beanbag, as we say in America, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing they said that stayed with me, I said, look, you've got an international coalition that is coming together against you. The United Nations is against you. Security Council resolution has passed sanctions against you. You've got the internationally recognized government of Yemen against you, and that has the Arab world largely on its side, plus Britain, plus America. You can't win. And they said, oh no, we will win. And I said, well, why do you think you'll win? And they said, it's not about the balance of the forces. It's about whether you care or not. He said, you care and we don't. He said, so we don't, you care about every Yemeni who dies. Don't know why it matters to you, but you do. He said, we don't care how many Yemenis die. And so eventually this war will drag on and enough Yemenis will die and you will come to us and ask for peace.
This is a very important point. I just want to talk about it for a moment more because it's very hard, I think, for a Westerner to understand the idea that the Houthis in this case think, we don't care how many of our brothers get killed. We're not like you. It doesn't matter to us. I think it's not dissimilar from what we've been seeing over past days in Iran, where the regime says, if I have to kill 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 young people, I'll do that. You care. I don't care. I'm going to win. That's all I care. Or let me go further. It's what Hamas thought in this war, in the most recent 2-year war with Israel. The Israelis will kill as many people, will accept as many deaths as necessary, will encourage and facilitate that by making civilians into human shields for us while we hide in our tunnels, by booby-trapping buildings. And the more Gazans are killed, the better for our cause, and we will shed no salty tears for that. Now, this is true in all three cases. Correct me if I'm wrong. And yet, I think a lot of people would just find this, if they're listening to us, the kind of people I think don't listen to a program like this, they would find it hard to believe and hard to imagine. It's beyond their ken. It's beyond, they're too locked in their cultural bubble to understand people who are actually like this. They want to think, it's like that song by Sting, if the Russians care about their children. Of course they care about their children. And the Russians are a different kettle of fish, I would say. I won't go into that now. But if you're a serious jihadist, and I think they are in each of these three cases, you really not only don't mind, you think it's helpful to us if our brothers, sisters, daughters, children are slaughtered. We want them dead.
Yeah, I mean, Cliff, you are exactly right. I couldn't agree more with those analogies. And I want to sort of develop the Hamas one as being particularly resonant because in many ways the dynamics are so similar between the situation in Gaza and the situation in Yemen. And I think the thing I would add to what you've just said, and this is perhaps where we don't give them enough credit for their strategic awareness, is that they also understand us better than we would wish or would know. And they understand all of the fissures in Western society and all of our neuroses. And so both the Houthis and Hamas made a correct bet that the loudest voices in the West would really only be interested in casualties that could be attributed either to Israel in the case of Gaza or to Saudi Arabia / US / UK in the case of Yemen.
Right. And Congress, of course, shut down the Saudi efforts in Yemen on humanitarian basis. Too many civilians are being killed, they said. Now, there are other aspects to that, but that was a big part of it, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. I want to talk about that slogan that they have, which is, if nothing else, very candid in terms of their ambitions. I believe it's called a sarka, which literally translates.
Yeah, which means scream in Arabic.
It's an interesting thing that you have it's not just a slogan or a motto. It's a scream that tells you something, I think. No? I mean.
It does.
All right. And by the way, I also understand that they chant it collectively. And so you wonder if they work themselves up into a kind of lather when they're chanting things like that. And that there was an inspiration. It was inspired, at least in large measure, by the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. As you know, I was there for a few months and covering it. That's where the phrase "death to America, death to Israel" was chanted. In a way, what they have done is to sort of tweak it, edit it, elaborate on it, and go beyond just death to America, death to Israel, with curse the Jews, and with victory to Islam. I mean, they've made it kind of more explicit. It's also interesting, because it takes us to the fact, I think, that the Houthis were inspired by the Islamic Revolution, so-called, in Iran. I have that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, we probably don't want to go too deep into the history, but the Houthi movement really emerged in the 1990s as a sort of so-called Zaidi revivalist movement. Zaidi being the strain of Islam that is practiced in the north of Yemen, close in the mountains, close to the Saudi border. And Zaidism, a bit like the Alawites in Syria, are best thought of as Shia adjacent. They're not absolutely Shia, but they tend to align with the Shia. And of course, because the Sunnis tend to be quite orthodox and the Saudis have tended to be very orthodox about, insisting on people sort of conforming to their view of Islam, it tends to push people like the Zaydis and the Alawites and the Ibadis in Oman to be more sympathetic to Iran and the Shia. So that's an element of it. I love what you said about the way that the Houthi scream has come from that Iranian influence. You could call it the Yemeni remix of what you experienced in 1979 or thereabouts. And I think there's a couple of things I want to say about this. One is when people tell you who they are, believe them. This is one of the most distressing weaknesses of the West, is that we've become so complacent about our rightness that we simply assume that everybody is just making their way to be like us eventually. Mm-hmm. And that, if they say unfortunate things like death to Israel or curse on the Jews or death to America, that's just, they're just being a bit quaint. It's a bit old fashioned, but they'll get over it. Is the sort of, that's the diplomatic sort of approach.
I got to tell you, I so know what you mean. I do remember this, and it was NPR, and it was a correspondent in Iran, and his explanation was to say, that's just a way of talking, this death to America, death to Israel. Like, for example, if they get into a traffic jam, they'll say death to traffic. I mean, just the contortions. Probably some minder told him that, thinking this idiot will believe me on this, right?
So here's another little anecdote that I always enjoy from my time. Going back to the peace talks in Kuwait, which took place in 2016, and I transplanted to Kuwait for a couple of months for those. So I was living away from home in a luxury hotel in Kuwait, which was both good and bad in some ways. But what was really extraordinary was seeing the Houthis in that setting. Of course, they're very self-consciously tough guys. We can take however much pain you throw at us. We don't need anything. We live in the Stone Age. You're going to bomb us back to the Stone Age. That's where we like to live, is the sort of attitude. But you saw them in Kuwait, and oh my goodness, did they like the luxury hotel? And did they like the limousines? And they managed to persuade the Kuwaitis, who were absolutely horrified by this rabble that they'd imported. They managed to persuade them that they should be allowed an endless supply of GAT, the stimulant drug, sort of like a leaf
QAT.
that they chew. QAT, that's right, exactly.
I'm old enough, I can't. I tried it actually in Ethiopia one time. In northern Ethiopia.
Yeah, the Ethiopians grow. Apparently, the Ethiopian GAT is better than the Yemeni GAT, but I wouldn't say that to a Yemeni.
I would prefer a good Scotch or bourbon or rye, to tell you the truth. But that's just me.
Well, so would I. But one of the tragedies of Yemen is that it's almost a national addiction to this stimulant, which is somewhere on the scale between caffeine and amphetamines in terms of the way it speeds you up. So you talked about the sarqa, the scream. And of course, they do scream because they work themselves up into such a pitch of excitement, partly because they're off their heads on GAT half of the time. But to finish the Kuwait anecdote, what was extraordinary was that, of course, we were trying to indulge them because we were trying to keep them at the table and talk to them. And in Kuwait, by the way, importing GAT it could get you the death penalty. But the Kuwaitis brought it in and gave the Houthis a constant supply of it, because otherwise the Houthis were threatening to walk out and go home. They were absolutely outrageous the way they behaved. They threw tantrums. They walked out of meetings. They turned up late. They insulted people, and it was quite a scene. But at one point, the head of the Houthi delegation got himself thrown off Facebook. And the reason he was thrown off Facebook was that Facebook noticed that there was a lot of hateful content on his pages, as you might imagine. And, it included the Sache, so there's stuff there that, that Facebook didn't approve of. Well, then he came to the US and said, but this isn't fair. We need Facebook because we're supposed to be negotiating with you, and, you need to help us with this. And, DC was in a sort of let's give these peace talks a chance of success sort of mood. So they managed to intercede with Facebook and get this guy back on Facebook. But whilst this was going on, of course, Facebook needed some data to correct the mistake, if it was a mistake, and they needed his ID, his documents. And so he handed over his passport for this purpose. And it turned out that, according to his passport, he was 13 years old. Now, I can assure you that, having spent a lot of time in a lot of rooms with this guy, he was not as old as me, but nor was he young enough to be my grandson. And so we said to him, "Well, it says here that you're 13 years old." And he said, "Oh, it's my son's passport. I don't have one. I just came here on my son's passport."
Wow. This is something I've been confused about a little bit. What the Houthis are. I thought they were probably a tribe or a clan. I'm seeing in various things, but you tell me that they're more like, it's more a movement, even though it's dominated by one family. Is that how would you define it?
So it's a little bit of all of that. The best way to think of it is that you've got right up in the far north of Yemen, hard against the Saudi border, in the mountains, there is a province called Sada. And in Sada, there is a small town called Houth. So the Houthis are, from Houth. But that said, they are a Zaidi revivalist movement, and therefore they are arguing that the Zaidis, who are about a third of the Yemeni population, mainly in the north, ought to govern the country as they have historically for 1,000 years.
They've been the aristocracy, so to speak, of the country, in that sense?
They are, exactly. The Zaidis consider themselves
the Zaidis,
elite
not the
of
Houthis,
Yemen.
but the Zaidis in general. Yeah, okay.
They do. And then the Houthis consider themselves the elite of the Zaidis. In other words, there is a clan, there is a tribe that is core to this, including Abdul Malik al-Houthi himself, who is the leader of the Houthis.
And since they're close up to the border with Arabia, with Saudi Arabia, with a Sunni homeland, how did they end up to be Shia or Shia adjacent?
Well, it's a good,
if as you will.
Yeah, it's a good question. And of course, these borders are relatively recent things. One of the things people don't realize is that Houthis have territorial claims on Saudi Arabia. And most concerning for the Saudis, the Houthis claim that they should control Mecca and Medina, the holy places.
Really?
They would like to banish the Saudis to the sort of the desert north of the country. And they would like to control the whole southern half of the Arabian Peninsula. And that's something the Saudis need to think about, because they're always trying to buy off the Houthis, but the Houthis are likely to persist in these demands over time. Now, in the old days, for 1,000 years, you had something called the imamate, and it was effectively what governed this very inaccessible mountainous territory on the interior of the peninsula. And it was fertile. I mean, it was beautiful land. The Romans had called it Arabia Felix, right. Blessed Arabia, beautiful Arabia.
This is in the south.
And,
yeah. This is in the south, just so I'm getting the map in my mind.
So this is in the north of Yemen.
North of Yemen, but south of
Saudi
Arabia. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Southern Yemen is very arid and very hot, but the north is mountainous, and you have rainfall, and you have mountain terraces that are fertile, that's where they originally grew coffee. Mocha is a town in Yemen because coffee was grown in northern Yemen, and that was how it was actually discovered. But unfortunately, coffee and gat grow in the same kind of terrain, and so coffee has been wholly displaced from Yemen by the gat crop.
Were slaves brought into Yemen from Africa as they were to other parts of Arabia?
That's a good question. Do you know, I don't know. I imagine historically that probably happened to some degree, but I can't say for sure.
Right. And there was, I know, how to say, I want to say this is a nice way, there was, between Yemen and Ethiopia and I think, and the Middle East, there was exchanges across the Red Sea, quite a bit. I know that in part because when I've talked to Ethiopians, and I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia, they would say, we're really more Middle Eastern than African, if you're talking to the Amhara, because most of our intercourse was not north to south. It was across the Red Sea. So we know the Arabs, we know the Jews, we know the Yemenis. Those are the people we know. Anyhow, I don't want to go into big digression.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
but absolutely true, Clive. And the very word Swahili, of course, which is spoken in the coastal areas of Kenya and to some degree in Somalia, that actually is an Arabic word meaning coastal dweller.
Right, similar to the Sahel. It's the same root, I believe, as Sahel in Swahili.
Well,
No?
actually,
Maybe not.
I think
No,
it's
maybe I
to
was
do with the
wrong.
word.
Okay.
It's linked to the word for sand.
Right. But Swahili, I do know it is sort of a Creole of Arabic and local languages, and it was used by the slave traders, by the way, so that they could bring in and sell and talk through that. So anyhow.
Exactly, but so just to come back to your original question, the evolution of Islam in the Imamate. If you think about it, these were the formative years of Islam. It was expanding still dramatically. The Imamate goes back to the 10th century, so as I say, more than 1,000 years, and it was in this very inaccessible area. So Islam was able to evolve in its own shape in that part in Yemen, and it was this particular form of Shiism or of Islam was particularly adapted to their needs because they needed if you like, a sort of a God's representative on earth, who of course these days is Abdul Malik al-Houthi, which is more in the Shia way of thinking rather than the Sunni way of thinking, which is much more about the fact that, you have priests, but everybody is allowed to interpret the word of Allah the way they want. But instead, in the Imamate, you had a kind of a warrior prince who was also the prophet.
Pretty close to a caliph, except in the Shia tradition rather than the
exactly, a Shia caliph.
And sorts. Tell me if this is wrong. The guy who's seen as the head of the movement of the Houthi rebels was Hussein al-Houthi, and he lived in Qom for a while, I believe, which was the holiest city in Iran, and I think he was there inspired by the rhetoric and of the Islamic Revolution that took place. So it must have been fairly late when he got there. Yeah.
Absolutely. He was actually a relatively young guy because he was actually only the older brother of the current guy. So Abdul Malik al-Houthi, who is currently the head of the Houthis, is probably, I guess he's pushing 50 now, but he's quite young. And his elder brother, would have been in those days, back in the 90s when the Houthi movement was really getting started. He was probably only in his 30s or so. He spent time in Iran. A lot of the Houthis have spent time in Iran. And one thing that people don't realize is that Lebanese Hezbollah got very much involved in the evolution of the Houthi movement from the 90s onwards. So Fadlallah and Nasrallah of Lebanese Hezbollah both spent time in Yemen mentoring the Houthis. And the Houthis are also known as Ansar Allah. And Hezbollah, as you know, means party of God. Ansar Allah means partisans of God.
Right. I've got so many questions that I want to discuss, but I can't resist this digression. And that is that there was a British romantic comedy in 2011 based on a novel from 2007 called Salmon Fishing in the Yemen. And part of what's interesting is 2007, that's just 6 years after 9/11, and then the movie is a few years later. So it's before the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in 2014, obviously. But a couple interesting things. First, obviously, there are no salmon in Yemen. Secondly, but the idea, the movie starts some very good actors: Ewan McGregor, Emily Blunt, Kristen Scott Thomas. The most interesting thing to me was that the Yemeni the sheikh from Yemen, was depicted. His idea is he wants to import salmon to Yemen for fishing because he's portrayed as this gentle, philosophical, benevolent figure, wealthy, cultured, spiritual, a wise dreamer with a quixotic dream about faith, hope, and this was the image that Hollywood and the artistic left really have wanted of the Middle East. And even after 9/11, they were still going to produce this fable. It's a very entertaining movie, don't get me wrong, there's good acting, but it has nothing to do with the reality of the Middle East. It avoids and distorts what the reality, and particularly for it to be Yemen, where if the sheikh was that smart, he would know you need cold water for salmon. There's no way you could actually do this. Anyhow, I throw it out at you and I tell people, see the movie, but what it tells about the artistic left, about Hollywood, which we just saw what was it, the Grammys or the Oscars, I forget.
Yes, I mean they can't resist their noble savage, can they? And
okay.
It's both naive because these are actually cutthroats and they're power brokers and they're tough guys and they're fighters, and it's also patronizing, because it sort of it sort of ignores the fact that Yemen actually can be, at its best, very sophisticated. You've got educated people, you've got business people, the Hale Said family, whom I'm sure you know, Cliff, and I've met them in with FDD in the past, running sort of a massive international conglomerate. So it's an absurd caricature. But the one thing I did want to add on this is it's one of the tragedies of Yemen is that it can never even get a benefit from its cultural profile. It does have a cultural profile and it has a great history. And as you know, there's amazing architecture in Yemen. They built these sort of mud buildings into skyscrapers, which nobody else did anywhere in the sort of the ancient world. But two things: coffee, invented in Yemen. Nobody grows it in Yemen. Salmon fishing in the Yemen. If they had any kind of security, they could have filmed it there. But of course, they couldn't film it there because it wasn't safe.
Right. They filmed it, I believe, in Morocco, is what if I remember correctly. So the Houthis in the area where they are in control, do they govern? Do they provide police and sanitation and electric? I mean, do they do all that stuff?
They do. I mean, one of the important things to say about the Houthis is that partly with Iranian mentoring, and mentoring also from Lebanese Hezbollah and to some degree from the Iraqi Shia groups, they actually are very, very sophisticated. When they took over, as you say, they occupied Sana'a in 2014, they knew exactly where to go. They went straight for the key buildings. They took over the central bank and they took over the telecommunications apparatus. This was no sort of, these were not sort of hungry savages, sort of, disorientated in the big city. They actually made a takeover of the state, and they do all of that stuff. They understand the importance of education, and of course, one of the absolute monstrosities of the Houthis is that that scream that we talked about. They indoctrinate kids from the age of 5, 6, 7 to scream, curse on the Jews, death to America, death to Israel. And of course, the Houthis are horribly guilty also of recruiting child soldiers. So they're using the schools to look at kids, who've got the sort of the capabilities to be effective fighters and who then may end up dead in a fight, at the age of 14 or 15. So yeah, they do. They actually are running a pretty sophisticated state, but it's absolutely geared. It's a security state. It's geared to their war machine.
And the money necessary to run the state, is that from the international donor community, so to speak, through humanitarian aid, or from the Iranians? Or the Iranians say, no, look, we'll supply the missiles, you supply the food and medicine. How does that work?
So it's both. I mean, Yemen has some resources. Obviously, if you run a state, then you've got the ability to tax your people. Even if they're poor, you can tax them. So they've got the coffers of the state. They also have, as you said, a lot of support from the Iranians. And that support is both financial support as well as military support and other sort of technical support. And then you mentioned the humanitarian aid diversion, and this is an absolute tragedy. This is where the international community again has become so complacent and so lazy. Humanitarian delivery used to involve people, actually getting out into the dust, rolling up their sleeves, and digging wells. Doesn't look like that very much these days. A lot of it is about proving that you've been able to move money through some kind of voucher system, and it's now located in a place where it can be spent. This has particularly been the case in Afghanistan since the Taliban came back to power, and a lot of the humanitarian support to the Afghans has been in terms of stabilizing the economy and boosting demand in the economy. And of course, a lot of the supply that's coming into Yemen is also food, because the Yemenis have been chronically food insecure now ever since the civil war started. So for more than a decade now, the number of people who've actually died of starvation is relatively low. But the UN has been regularly sort of frightening people by saying 20 million people are food insecure, and we think 5 million might die of starvation this year. And of course, as with all of these sort of Cassandra predictions from the UN, it never happens, just like Gaza, which, again, let's not get distracted onto Gaza, but we could do a whole podcast on that one.
Right. Well,
But aid diversion is a huge problem. The UN thinks that all that matters is to deliver into the area where the hardship exists, and they don't monitor the recipients. And of course, the Houthis don't let them monitor the recipients either. And the Houthis regularly arrest and abuse humanitarian workers, including UN staff. But the effect of this is that huge amounts of money and huge amounts of supplies are going into Yemen, and we cannot say who the end user was. And the Houthis, of course, have enriched themselves from it.
How much will it hurt the Houthis if the regime in Iran collapses or falls apart or is enfeebled by U.S. military action over the days ahead? We're recording this on Wednesday, I should say, the 4th of February.
Well, in my view, the single biggest factor in containing the Houthis will be the defeat of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because if you think about it, there are only a few options. Just playing whack-a-mole with the Houthis is not terribly efficient. As you know, the US expended unbelievable amounts of ordnance. But, the people that they were killing and the equipment they were destroying was relatively cheaply replaced from the Houthis' point of view. So there's sort of an asymmetry there in terms of the kind of weapon systems that we have been using against them. The Israelis, I think, showed a more interesting approach, which was more in the nature of decapitation. And of course, they made an incredibly effective strike on the Houthis on the 28th of August last year, which really did knock them sideways. And the Houthis have actually been communicating who died in that strike on a monthly basis ever since. They couldn't admit to it at first because they were afraid it would show how weak they were. But of course, over time, these people have been tracked, and it's turned out that this person has not been seen since before the 28th of August. And then eventually their funeral turns up in November or December or whatever. So the Israelis could perhaps have taken out Abdul Malik, and that's one potential approach, is that you could say, well, look, we've said this is a terrorist group. The US obviously defines the Houthis as a terrorist group. If you can kill Baghdadi, if you can kill bin Laden and Zawahiri, you can kill Abdul Malik al-Houthi. And because he is so much in charge and he's such a capable leader, it could make a real difference to the Houthis if that were to happen. But the other thing is to harmonize your Yemen policy with your Iran policy, and to say, the Houthis are to some degree a cat's paw of Iran, and when they're kicking off in the Red Sea and preventing commercial shipping from going through the Red Sea, it's being enabled by the Iranians. The Iranians are supplying the Houthis with the missiles and the drones that they're using. The Iranians are supplying intelligence from their spy ship, and so do what Donald Trump said he would do last year, which is, I will hold Iran directly responsible for anything that the Houthis do against shipping in the Red Sea. He said he would do it. He should do it.
I wanted to at least mention this as well. There used to be, for a very long time, a vibrant Jewish population or community in Yemen. They've all either left or been expelled over the years. I think there's one Jew left, and he's in prison. And he's in prison for trying to smuggle an 800-year-old Torah scroll out of the country, if I understand correctly. But it's an important thing. It was a sort of unique Jewish culture compared to any other. One of the things I happen to remember, because I met some Yemeni Jews in Israel, is that it was traditional for Yemenis to go in to see a Jewish jewelers. They were jewelers by vocation for generations with very specific skills, and give him several pieces of silver. Some he'd put in his pocket, the rest he would take and hammer into a very particular kind of headdress for Yemeni brides for weddings. And in fact, I remember in Jaffa, someone had set up a shop to sell that sort of thing, but also said if we don't pass on the traditions of this kind of jewelry, they'll disappear forever. It's not written down, and I'm going to do that here. I want people, in 50 years to still know how to do this, even if we Jews never go back to Yemen. Who knows? Anyhow, I just throw that out. Anything you want to say? It's an interesting and very distinct. Their community with their rituals and all that are very different from Ashkenazi Jews or even Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews, meaning other Middle Eastern Jews.
Absolutely. Just as Yemen itself was a sort of, in some ways, a sort of an isolated experiment in this very inaccessible terrain, likewise, its Jewish community was very singular and had its own traditions. And of course, this tragedy of its being gradually, persecuted into, as you say, today, effectively into extinction with just one man in jail. There were some previous rounds of persecution that happened during the Imamate, but this, as everywhere else in the Arab world, this really gathered pace after the Second World War and after the creation of the State of Israel. You must have, I'm sure, seen the charts where they show the Jewish population of a whole range of Arab countries as it was in 1945 and as it is now. And then, incredibly, people talk about the Palestinian right of return. What about the Jewish right of return to all these countries that these people were expelled from through absolutely no fault of their own?
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Yemen's wars, starting with the ongoing civil war. That conflict has caused, I believe, the best estimates I've seen, 233,000 deaths and displaced 3.65 million people. I think about wait till they hear about this at Harvard, Columbia, and the University of Pennsylvania. They're just going to be livid when they hear about this. All right. With the government against which the Houthis are rebelling, is it a reasonable government? Is it a government that the U.S. and others should be supporting?
I mean, short answer to that would be a qualified yes. But the longer answer is that it's complicated, as you might expect. Yemen has always been dysfunctional on some level. It was dysfunctional at the time of the independence from Britain in the south, the civil war that followed that. As you may recall, the Egyptians backed one side, the Saudis backed the other. You ended up with a Yemeni Arab Republic in the north, and you end up with the People's Democratic Republic of the Yemen in the south, which was sort of Arab socialist or communist, vaguely part of the Eastern Bloc in a way. And then you had reunification in 1990. But then very shortly after that, it collapsed into civil war again. The North was beating up on the South, as it tends to do. And this comes back to this Zaidi-Sunni divide that exists in Yemen, with the Sunnis predominantly in the south and the east of the country, and the Zaidis predominantly in the north of the country. But the Zaidis, as a one-third minority of the population, having always governed. So the leader of North Yemen before reunification in 1990 was a guy called Ali Abdullah Saleh, who I mentioned earlier, the one who the Houthis killed. Now he was a Zaidi. He was from the north. He was the governor. He was the head of the north. And when the two halves reunited, and you had the creation of the Yemeni Republic in 1990, Saleh continued as the leader of the unified country, and he continued as the leader all the way up to the Arab Spring. He was only displaced by the Arab Spring in 2012. He was a very, very dodgy leader of Yemen. He was highly manipulative, a sort of authoritarian. He was the one who coined a famous phrase about Yemen, that governing Yemen, it requires you to dance on the heads of snakes. And he reckoned that he was the best dancer. He could dance on the heads of these snakes and maintain this balancing act between all of the different constituencies of Yemen and keep things together. And of course, he managed to do that until he fell from power. And then eventually he tried to do it again and got killed by the Houthis. Now, the people that's left behind are a coalition against the Houthis. And of course, a lot of the coalition are Southerners, Southern Sunnis. And those Southerners have never forgiven the Zaidis in the north for having crushed them after the reunification and abused them and treated them as second-class citizens. And then the Houthis reminded them of that when they came south to Sana'a in 2014, to Aden in 2015. They didn't take Aden, but they managed to get into it. The cruelty that they showed, because the Houthis regard the southern Yemenis and particularly the Sunni Yemenis as subhuman, and they treat them appallingly. Again, all of these people who worry about human rights in Yemen, they only care if it's the Saudis who are killing them with their bombs, or if we're somehow to blame because we're supplying the Saudis with munitions. But the fact that the Houthis have been brutalizing the population for the last dozen years, that seems to pass them by entirely. Now, so that if you think about the rest of Yemen, the part of Yemen that is not currently under Houthi rule, as being predominantly Sunni and predominantly southern.
And about 2/3 of the country you're talking about now, right? The population? Well,
so it would be 2/3, but the Houthis have managed to expand their control beyond just the Zaydis. So even though the Zaydis are only 1/3 of the population, the Houthis currently control about 2/3 of the population.
Including a big population of Sunnis.
Including a big population of Sunnis, exactly. That's right. The larger landmass, but only 1/3 of the population, is outside their control and is governed by the internationally recognized government of Yemen. And that is a coalition of the Southern Transitional Council, which is a southern movement, but also a number of northern parties that reject the Houthis. And that includes, rather awkwardly in the present political climate, includes the Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Islah Party, which is the Yemeni manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood.
And I guess I should ask, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, where do they fit in Yemen?
So ISIS conveniently just hates everybody and wants to kill as many people as they can. So nobody wants to work with them. They really are, well, they are what we sometimes call in England the Millwall supporters of jihadism. No one likes us, we don't care. But Al-Qaeda is much more strategic, and it's embedded in the tribes. And at various times, yes, it has been able to embed itself in some of the coalition aligned with the government of Yemen. That has more or less faded away now. And the reason for that is that when the US killed Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul in 2022, there was an unintended consequence. It meant that the leader of Al-Qaeda was no longer in Afghanistan. He was in Iran. So Saif al-Adl, who was the Al-Qaeda number 2, took over as the leader of Al-Qaeda and stayed in Tehran. And that has made Al-Qaeda part of the Iranian axis of whatever we want to call it. They like to call it the axis of resistance. And over the 3.5 years since that happened, there has been a rapprochement between Iran and Al-Qaeda, and there has been a rapprochement between the Houthis and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
That's fascinating, and that should be the subject of a whole nother discussion. Because to be honest with you, I think very few people, including at high levels in Washington, understand how that the regime in Iran and Al-Qaeda are now closely connected, as you just described. So if you want to continue to fight Al-Qaeda and you want to fight the regime in Iran, actually it's more, it's two birds with one stone, as it were. Anyhow, it's an important subject, which maybe we'll come back to in writing or research or podcasting or all of the above at some point. The Saudis and the Emiratis, both Sunni, until like yesterday, they were really close friends. Now they are kind of in a feud, maybe, and that's the proper word, not least over Yemen, right?
Absolutely. There aren't many things in the Middle East that surprise or shock me, but that one did. That surprised and shocked me because my whole background of serving as a diplomat in the Arabian Peninsula had shown me no closer alliance, no closer identity of interests or like-mindedness than that between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And, I can remember senior Emiratis saying to me, Saudi national security is almost more important to us than our own because we need Saudi to succeed for us to succeed. And so to see them fall out over Yemen has been really shocking and surprising and very unwelcome, by the way. Houthis will love it. The Qataris will love it. The Turks will love it. But this is what happens, I think, when you have a long unresolved civil war like the one in Yemen, and people start to think in terms of, what could I do just to get out of this? How do I sort of free myself from this unfortunate sort of morass that I've got myself bogged down in. And so during the period that the Saudis have not been actively fighting the Houthis for the last few years, they've been very focused on just finding a formula to get out of Yemen. That's why when the Houthis shut the Red Sea to commercial shipping after the 7th of October 2023, the Saudis should have been outraged. They should have been leading the charge to say the Houthis must not be allowed to do this. They must be coerced into allowing freedom of navigation. It's the Saudi ports that are affected by this. They have Jeddah and they have other ports on the Red Sea. And those ports were, of course, directly affected by the fact that no ship could safely navigate the Red Sea. Egypt also, because of the Suez Canal and the Suez Canal revenues. The Saudis were weirdly quiet about this.
As were the Egyptians, by the way. They didn't,
as were the
close
Egyptians.
Down the Suez Canal. Not our problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the reason for this was that the Saudis found it very inconvenient because it kind of stopped them from figuring out how to get out of the Yemeni civil war, which they just got tired of the criticism they were getting, the money it was costing them, the fact that they weren't winning it, so it was not good reputationally either. It was at best it was a stalemate, and so they were desperate to get out, and they were talking to the Houthis about, what would it take? How do we get out? You just don't threaten us. But, we don't want to threaten you either. We can figure out something. And the Saudis used their leverage with the internationally recognized government of Yemen to stop it from taking various initiatives that were hostile to the Houthis. Because the Houthis would turn around to the Saudis and say, we don't like what they're doing. You stop them doing it. Otherwise, we're going to restart active hostilities against you. And the Saudis didn't want that. Well, the problem with this is that kind of meant that Saudi policy on Yemen was absolutely stuck. It was not going anywhere other than some vague hope of getting out. The Emiratis had a different approach. And of course, this does also reflect the fact that the UAE does not have a border with Yemen. So for them, this is not an existential national security issue. The Houthis are not coming over the Emirati border. And so the Emiratis can afford to play a little bit in Yemen. And the Emiratis have formed a model in recent years where they're comfortable dealing with sub-state actors, like they have a profile, a presence in Somaliland, for example, regardless of the status of Somalia. They also have worked with the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, and they are very comfortable working with the Southern Transitional Council, or essentially the Southern Separatists in Yemen. And part of the way that the Emiratis view all this is it's a sort of a naval vector. They're looking for ports where they can have influence, and so that you can see ports all the way down the Gulf of Aden and all the way onto the Horn of Africa, where the Emiratis have influence. Problem being, of course, that the more that they invested in these separatist forces in Yemen, the more it became likely that this frozen civil war would actually then erupt in an unexpected direction. And that's what happened late last year when the Southerners suddenly took over a very large part of the South from the internationally recognized government. And when that happened, it let off massive alarm bells in Riyadh. And they said, well, hang on a sec, we can't have Yemen fragmenting on our doorstep. Otherwise, we'll never have peace.
So these Southerners are Sunni, but they're also in opposition to the government and in opposition to the Houthis as well. Okay, yeah.
Exactly so.
The Houthis, as you mentioned, successfully shut down shipping in the Red Sea through the Suez Canal, controlling the Bab al-Mandab, which is this narrow strait that from the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea, I believe, if I remember correctly. Yeah, okay.
That's correct.
And amazingly, as you say, the Saudis turned a blind eye, the Egyptians turned a blind eye, the international community, for the most part, turned a blind eye. For a while, the U.S. I took a very stupid posture, I guess this is mostly in the Biden administration, where the missiles would be shot from the Houthis, and, we can shoot down those missiles with very expensive munitions, rather than, you're shooting down arrows, not archers, and not those who supply the archers. Made no sense. Trump hit them, but hit them once and said, I'm done. The Israelis hit, as you say, probably more consequentially, hitting up an important harbor, Hodeidah, I think it was. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. At this point, the so-called international community, maybe the Brits took it a little bit. I don't remember for sure. The Brits certainly should. This was a great naval empire of the world. Freedom of the seas is the most basic of international laws. Anyway, but if I'm understanding, and I may not be, shipping in the Red Sea has resumed or is resuming. The Houthis have backed off. I'm not sure why. Is that right?
That's right up to a point. I mean, it hasn't fully recovered because people are still not comfortable that this is a stable outcome. And so not just shipping companies, but also insurance companies have, sort of started to look at this and say, well, is it worth the risk? And yes, it costs more to go around the southern tip of Africa. But, maybe that's actually less of a risk from an insurance point of view than it is to go through the Red Sea. Now, it's true that shipping has climbed back. The reason that the Houthis stopped their campaign, of course, was the ceasefire in Gaza. The Houthis had been saying all along, if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, then we will discontinue our attacks. Now, some people have overread that and said, oh, well, all they want is, they just want peace in the Middle East and they just want the Palestinians to have their rights. No, the Houthis have done this before. They've actually attacked shipping in the Red Sea before. They'll do it whenever they want to make a point. And in this particular case, the point they wanted to make was that they were great supporters of the Palestinians. But the problem here, of course, is, you were saying that the Bab el-Mandeb is the access from the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea. Of course, the Arabian Sea is the opening into the Indian Ocean. So in other words, if you're in the Red Sea, you are effectively locked in. Whereas once you get through the Bab el-Mandeb, you're out in the high seas. And so this is an absolutely crucial shipping route. It was massively important. The Biden administration, their sort of rules of engagement were self-defeatingly restrictive. The Brits deployed with the Americans, so there was a British-American task force in the Red Sea, and as you say, it was not engaging sensibly. I can even remember public statements by the Brits saying, because they were justifying in Parliament the fact that they had, that they were sort of taking part in a military operation, and they said, we had this successful operation where we destroyed this many missile launchers and no casualties, they said, no casualties. And in other words, they were saying that they were making it a point of virtue that none of the Houthis were being killed. As you said, we only hit arrows, we didn't hit the archers, as a point of virtue. Now, that was craziness. It really was. And of course, the Houthis understood. Yes. They're not stupid.
It gets back to what you were saying earlier about them, yeah.
Yeah, they know perfectly well that we can't afford to expend, millions of dollars worth of military equipment in knocking out stuff that costs them $5,000 or $10,000. So they knew that was the case.
And we also didn't hit what you mentioned before, the Iranian intelligence ship that's supplying the targeting information to the Houthis. Put that at the bottom of the ocean, and that would have a very strong impact, as well as sending a message to the. But anyhow, hopefully that's changing. In May of last year, a Yemeni missile that eluded both U.S. THAAD and Israel's Arrow system hit Israel's main international airport. So my understanding is the Israelis still see the Houthis as a threat, as long as they have or are receiving missiles that they can fire. The question is how much of a threat and what can they do about it? And that brings in Israeli recognition of Somaliland next to Somalia, which is al-Shabaab, terrorist, a mess. Somaliland has been doing very well without recognition for a long time. It's a safe place. We've done a podcast on them on Somaliland recently with the representative and Mike Rubin. I recommend it to people. My point is, it also may provide the Israelis a place to, a place close to Yemen if they need it in order to take on the Houthis if the Houthis continue to represent some kind of threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from Israel's point of view, of course, they have to have a hierarchy of threats. Who would be Israel and face that hierarchy of threats? But they do, and they do it with a remarkably good grace. and they're going to look at Iran and say that's the big one. It's much more capable than the Houthis, much richer, and it's been sort of dedicated over a prolonged period to trying to destroy the state of Israel, and it lies behind the proxies. So again, it's a primary threat, whereas the Houthis as a proxy are a secondary threat. And I guess that within the hierarchy of the proxies, that Israel probably is still much more concerned about Lebanese Hezbollah than it is about the Houthis. They're just so close. And of course, they have historically been very capable, disciplined, very well armed, and able to create absolute mayhem in the northern part of Israel at will, which the Israelis finally and thankfully brought under control recently. But, there's no guarantee that that won't come back. And that's why the Israelis are so busy still mowing the lawn in Lebanon, because the Lebanese government has not stepped up and disarmed Hezbollah as they are supposed to. So if you talk to the Israelis, they'll say, yes, we're worried about the Houthis. They were more capable than we expected them to be. And we know that over time, if they're given the space to rearm and to regroup, they'll probably become more capable still. They'll have better drones, better missiles. And, next time it may be that more of their stuff will get through. As you know, that attack that affected the airport only really affected the edge of the airport. It was pretty, but what the Israelis did, of course, was they said to the Houthis, none of your attacks will be without a price. We will exact a price on you. And they did. And they attacked back. And of course, their attacks were far more effective than the Houthi attacks. So there was an element of deterrence there too. The Houthis wanted to make the point that they could strike Israel directly, but they also understood that the Israelis would have none of the American or the Biden era nervousness about civilian casualties, and none of the sort of international preciousness about critical infrastructure. So the Israelis wiped out large parts of Hodeidah port, and the Houthis, it's not so much the humanitarian supply aspect. They don't care if Yemenis starve. They do care if their financial pipeline is cut off. And of course, Hodeidah is absolutely central to their financial pipeline. So the Israelis knew what they were doing in the way that they combated the Houthis, but they will still be worried. I think what's happened is that the Israelis have gone from a standing start to a very high level of intelligence capability on Yemen, just as they did, in earlier eras. They had to do the same with other targets. And we saw during the 12-day war how brilliant their capabilities are in Iran. And of course, we saw their capabilities in Lebanon with the pagers and the walkie-talkies. So I think what the Israelis are banking on is that they can monitor the threat from the Houthis, deter it partially, and also they're hoping that developments in Iran will slow down Iranian resupply of the Houthis. But if that doesn't happen, if the Islamic Republic carries on, if the US chooses to walk away from the current confrontation, of course we don't know what's going to happen there, then one of the things that the Iranians will focus on will be rebuilding this asymmetric capability. It'll be rearming their proxies. It's harder for them to rearm Lebanese Hezbollah these days because they don't have a sympathetic government in Syria, but it's relatively easy for them to rearm the Houthis. And one of the things that we ought to be doing now is we ought to be waving a yellow card at the Omanis and saying this procurement and international liaison office and intelligence office and resupply smuggling office that you have in Muscat has to close, because whilst it's very difficult to stop all of the small dhow traffic that crosses the waters and lands resupply for the Houthis on the various Yemeni coasts, it is relatively easy to stop the overland resupply through Oman. But the Omanis don't want to stop it because, of course, it's penetrated their government and a lot of people are getting rich off it.
All right. My last question for today. We've gone along, but it's been fascinating and I could go on for another hour with you. What do you, if you were recommending to President Trump, if he were saying to you, okay, Edmund, Eddie, buddy, what should be our policy towards the Houthis? Should I appease them? Should I deter them? Should I contain them? Should I defeat them? What's feasible? And what do you recommend? Tell me what you recommend, Ed.
Okay, so in my view, appeasement is certain failure. these are not appeasable people. And I base that partly on my own direct experience of what they said. They will come back for more. They are like sort of turbocharged gangsters, gangsters with an extremist religious ideology underpinning their violence. So this is as bad as it gets in terms of the stability of dealing with them. And I mentioned the GAT, gangsters who are turbocharged also by this stimulant drug. So if you give them anything, they just say, okay, that's weakness. Great. I'll come back for more. This is where the Saudis have got it horribly wrong. If they try to pay protection money to the Houthis to get out of that civil war, the Houthis will be knocking on their door again in 5 years' time saying it's not enough. And so the Saudis ought to grasp the nettle. And while they have a sympathetic president in the White House, they ought to be talking to the US about how do we defeat the Houthis. Now, containment versus defeating versus decapitation, if you kill Abdul Malik al-Houthi, versus killing the puppet master. In other words, you commit yourself to regime change in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think my first recommendation to the Trump government would be, Trump administration would be, harmonize your Yemen policy with your Iran policy. Unless you intend to be blackmailed regularly by the Iranians and the Houthis, you need to deal with them both as part of a package. So that would be the first advice I would give. Second one, I think I would say try decapitation. You don't mind doing it. It's relatively cheap to do. And unusually in Abdul Malik al-Houthi, you have a leader who has been in charge for more than 20 years. He's strategically capable. He's a charismatic communicator, and he has unchallenged authority. And it's possible that if you kill Abdul Malik al-Houthi, that actually the Houthi movement struggles to produce an equally capable successor. And then, containment, of course, you're going to do some containment. In other words, you're going to come up against any sort of challenge that they make with force if necessary, but you're also going to have sanctions on them. You're going to move the United Nations out of the north and make it headquarter itself in the south exclusively. And the internationally recognized government of Yemen has said it is willing to pass aid internally to the front lines and across into Houthi-held territory. But you don't allow Hodeidah to function any longer because it's just been a source of blackmail by the Houthis. So you say, okay, right, you've made it unsafe to supply you through the Red Sea. So from now on, everything you're going to have to go cap in hand to the internationally recognized government of Yemen, and they will supply it to you across the land from Aden and Mukalla, the ports on the Arabian Sea. And then finally, I think my best solution to this is that you say, well, we seem to be in a situation right now where we are ready to move decisively for regime change in Iran. And actually that is going to solve a whole range of problems, and we go through with it. And once that has happened, the Houthis have no more resupply. They're suddenly much weaker in relation to all of their neighbors, all of their adversaries, including their political opponents in Yemen. And then you try to revive a discussion in Yemen about some form of heavily decentralized confederation, which might just succeed in governing that country without it falling into pieces.
Well, I'll just conclude by saying that if Abdul Malik al-Houthi suddenly finds himself sharing a jail cell in Brooklyn with Nicolas Maduro, he'll know who to blame. Edmund, always a pleasure to talk to you. I always learn a lot, and I hope and very grateful to have you as a colleague.
Thanks, Cliff. It's really great to be with FDD. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'll come back anytime you invite me.
You bet. And thank you all for listening, for being here with us for this conversation today on Foreign Policy.